Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers. I know you're expecting to see two types of mist in today's episode, and I promise that will be with you shortly. But I thought I would take a checkpoint to refine what we've done in the project so far, and in particular I want to show you how to set up reflections in the lake, which I think will look even better with the mist that's coming up. So let's get straight into it. Let's start off by talking about a couple of potential performance issues, and the first one is regarding foliage and virtual shadow maps. I've talked about foliage issues before in a previous video. You can see it in the card above on foliage hints and tips, but one of the issues there was to do with the shadows if you've got a lot of foliage in your scene. So let me show you the issue and I'll show you how to resolve it. So if I put the FPS up on screen by pressing Ctrl+Shift+H, so you see we're currently running at about 53, 54 frames per second. This is on an RTX 3080, which is quite a beefy card, so I would expect a better frame rate than this. And as I said, the issue is to do with the foliage moving and causing the shadow caches to be invalidated every frame. So we can minimize that issue by changing one setting. So if I go down to the console command and I search for shadow, start to type non-nanite, and you'll see this second setting, are shadow virtual non-nanite including coarse pages. If you select that and press space 0 to set it to 0, and my FPS has just shot up from about 50 something frames per second to 90 frames per second. So you're getting a huge increase there, about sort of 60% increase. So definitely worth doing that. And the second issue, oh, and something else to say about this, sorry, before I move on to the second one, is I'm in version 5.0.3 at the moment. Some future version of Unreal Engine may well solve these issues. I believe that there are sort of foliage improvements coming in version 5.1, which is due imminently. So just be aware that you may not need to do this in future versions. So always measure as you go along. Right, with that said, let's move on to the second potential issue, and that is to do with texture streaming. So let's switch off the FPS. Don't need that anymore on the screen. What you may notice, at the moment I haven't got an issue, but as you add more and more into your scene, once we've done our extra scenes with the campsite and the plane crash, we'll have introduced more textures into the scene. And in fact, when we do the mist as well in the next episode, we'll be introducing new textures there. And once you get over the budget for texture streaming, you'll get a red message appear here saying texture streaming over budget. And it won't stop the scene from working, but what it will do is it will reduce the quality of the textures, and you'll start to see more sort of pixelation and blurring, which we don't want. So we can increase that pool size. I'll show you how, first of all, how you measure it. If you go to the console and do stat streaming, it will show you all of the stats around the streaming texture. So the streaming pool, as you can see on this third line, is currently set to 1000 megabytes, 1 gigabyte, and our usage of it at the moment is 595 megabytes, or 59%. So it's well within the limit at the moment, but I know once I built out the full scene on this large landscape, it did go up to about 110, 120%. So let's nip that in the bud now and increase that streaming pool size. So to do that, go to your console, type streaming pool, and we want this r.streaming pool size, and just set that to 2000. And you see it goes up in the stats. Now we're only using 30%, and we shouldn't have an issue while we're here in the editor with textures that go blurry. So let's switch off this stats now And the last thing I want to show you how to do in this section of the video is to how to set these commands so that they run every time you load the project. At the moment, if I shut down the project and reload it, it will be back to square one with those two settings. So what we will do is we will set them in the config file for this project so they always get run when we load the project up. So to do that, go into Windows Explorer, find your project. My one's called Arctic Mist, and when you open it up you'll have a config folder, and within that you want to open up the default engine.ini file, and it'll have a whole load of settings already that you've set in your project settings. The two settings we've changed are all to do with rendering, so we'll put them in this script engine rendering or renderer settings section. So the easiest way to do that is to go back to the console command. There's a shortcut here, keyboard shortcut. If you do Alt up arrow, it shows you the history of commands you've typed. So let's start off with the first one. Control A, Control C to copy it, and then paste it in here in that section. Now there's a gotcha here. It doesn't have exactly the same format. It doesn't have the space in between. We need to put equals 0 for the value. And let's create a new line. So go back to the console command, delete what's on there, use Alt up arrow, and this time we'll select the streaming pool size, Control A, Control C to copy it, and then we'll paste that in here. And again, remembering to remove the space in between and make it equals. Okay, and do a Control S to save. Now when we reload the project, those two settings will be set as standard. Now let's talk about reflections. I've reset the camera to look across the lake, and you will notice that there are no tree reflections in our water, and that's because as of this current version 5.0.3, the water plugin, which is a single layer water material, doesn't support reflections in Lumen, although that is something that may change imminently. So when 5.1 comes out, I will check and see if that has been resolved. But assuming that it hasn't for the time being, what are your options for reflections? So what I'll do is I'll actually switch on the FPS again. It's Control-Shift-H, so we can see the effect of the reflections on performance. At the moment we've got sort of about 110 frames per second on average, which is pretty good. So let's go into the post-process volume, go down to about halfway until you find this section reflections, and if I click on the method you'll see that there are 4 methods. Well, the first one is none, so nothing. The second one is Lumen, which, as I said, doesn't support reflections in the single layer water, so that's what it's set to at the moment. It's not doing anything. The next one is called screen space reflection, so let's select that, and we now have some reflections, although there are some artifacts which I'll explain in a moment. Good thing is the performance is pretty good. We're still hovering at the high hundreds, 110, so it's had a very low impact on performance, but it's only reflecting what you see in the screen from the camera. So the two things you'll notice is at the edge of the scene it starts to fade out because it doesn't see all of the tree here. So as I move around, then those reflections come in to being only once they actually see everything that's in the scene. And the second thing is, as I dip the camera down below the shoreline, you'll see that the reflections start to disappear. So when I get to about here, all I can see is the trunks of the tree in the far shore. It's not really that much of an issue in my eyes, because as you actually in real life, when you look across a body of water, you often get this sort of Fresnel effect where it the light bounces off at an angle. You don't see many reflections, and because it's so cheap, if you were using this landscape in a game setting, I would say that the screen space is a very usable option. So what other option do we have? So underneath here we also have this ray traced option, but be aware of this, or beware I should say of this, because it's been deprecated, which means that they're phasing this out in order to phase in a better lumen or ray tracing option. Although I would still say that you can use it for now for cinematics. There isn't any other option at the moment, so it is a better ray tracing, or better reflection method I should say, albeit at a cost. So before we can choose this, we need to switch ray tracing on for our project. So go to Edit, Project Settings, search for ray tracing, and if you click on Support Hardware Ray Tracing here, it will say that you need to restart to apply new settings. So click on this. It may take a while to recompile the shaders because it has to create something called a skin cache. So I'll click on Restart, and then I'll see you in a moment once it's restarted. Okay, so I'm back in my project. It's restarted. If I search for ray tracing in the project settings, the other things I can change are use hardware ray tracing when available. If you've got an RTX card, that will hopefully make it slightly more performant, although weirdly I haven't found much difference in this scene. And then things like ray trace shadows you can put in. It will do slightly better fidelity on the shadows here, although it's quite minor, so I'll probably switch that off. For this we're just looking at the reflections. All right, so close that down, and currently we have our screen space reflection on. Let's switch the performance back on here. First thing you see is that the because we're using ray tracing, that alone has decreased the performance markedly. So let's go back to our post-process volume and down to reflections, and if we change screen space reflections to ray trace reflections, I don't know if you can see the difference here if I switch between them. So screen space reflections don't seem to reflect much of that sort of white ground, and they're quite sort of blurry, although they're not bad. But if you go to the ray traced one, you'll see I can see much more of the white ground, even the rocks, and I can see some more of the detail in the trees. So I would say for cinematic use, even though the performance here is quite noticeable, I would probably switch on the ray tracing for cinematics, but for game use I would switch off or switch it back to screen space here, and then in my project settings I would find ray trace and switch that off, and we'll have to restart again. When we generated the rocks in the last episode using a procedural foliage spawner, I didn't actually show the procedural settings for the rocks, and I'll show you why I made that mistake first of all, and then we'll correct it. If I go into the foliage mode, there's the two rocks there. So this is where we made our settings. So I selected here, and then I showed you in here, and we went in and looked at some of the settings here. The reason I didn't show you the procedural foliage settings is because they don't actually appear in the foliage mode. You have to open up the foliage type individually to see it. So of course I mistakenly talked about this density of 100, which isn't being used. That's only if you paint it on there, and the scales as well are set procedurally. So let's correct the issue now, come back into our main mode, and if we go into our content drawer, Megascans 3D assets, let's pick the first stone here, and if you find the foliage type, so it's this one here, var1 foliage type, double click to open that up, and let's just put it on the right of the screen, move it along a bit so we can see everything else. And what you'll notice now is that we can now see this procedural section. So let's correct the settings we want. So for example, the collision at the moment, I've got them 100 units apart. I wanted the rocks a bit closer together. So let's change these values here, the collision values of 50. So that will spawn those closer together. And similarly, let's look at some of the other settings. Yeah, at the moment the scale is between 1 and 3. I actually want some bigger rocks on there as well, so let's change that maximum to 6. And then I just want to make those changes to the other rock type as well. So let's save that. Come over here and go into the other stone, open up the foliage type, and again make the same changes. So collision radius to 50 and 50. And if I go down to the procedural scale, I'll set the maximum to 6. Okay, with that being done, now let's resimulate those rocks. So select our procedural foliage volume rocks here, go down to resimulate and click it, and after a few seconds, while it does it across the whole of the landscape, we now have larger rocks and they are closer together. In Unreal Engine 5, Epic introduced this feature called local exposure, and it's meant to be used in situations where you've got inside or interior and exterior scenes together, so that the exposure is the same, or you can see the detail in both of them. So you can see the scene outside that's lit and the scene inside that's low light. But I found there's another use for it as well, which is just to create slightly different looks for your landscape. So I'll just share that over the next minute or two. If you go to your post-process volume and scroll down until you find, in fact it's probably in the top section, local exposure, and open that up, and you've got these default settings here. So there's various ones you can change, but I've been playing around with these top two. So let me just show you the what changing these two settings does. If I change the contrast scale down to 0, it makes it more of a highlighted or a high key view, and if I go up to 2, it creates more contrast, so it creates a sort of a darker, more menacing feel. But if you combine that with the detail strength, you can get some interesting effects. So let's go back to the contrast scale of 1, and if I remove the detail to 0, you see it creates this almost soft Vaseline on the lens effect. It's sort of like a fog, but not quite the same as exponential height fog. And now you can change the contrast scale to, you can darken it and still have that soft look. You see, it's a completely different feel now, this landscape. And similarly, we can go the other way with it. We can put the detail strength up to create a sort of a more grainy effect, and then if you reduce this, you kind of introduce some of the lightness back in, but still have that graininess. Or if you increase it, you get sort of a real sort of monochromatic black and white effect. So have a play around with these and see if you can find a look and a feel that you want for your scene. I'm going to reset them now, but they're fun to play around with. My last topic today is about the boring but necessary task of organization. So we're starting to get more assets in our outliner here in our level, and in the next few episodes we're going to be adding even more. So it's probably a good time to start organizing things into folders. So I would start to create folders for landscape. I'll create the folders first, then I'll move things in there. I'll create a folder for lighting, create a folder for cloud, mist, fog, foliage, runtime virtual textures, and let's just leave it at that for now. So for the landscape, I'm going to move in the Open Land Texture Manager. So I'm going to hold down Control to select things I want. I'm going to hold the lake and the landscape and put that into the landscape folder. Shut that down. For the lighting, I'll choose my directional light, control click the skylight, put that in lighting. RVT, we'll choose these two RVT volumes, put them in there. For the cloud mist fog, we'll do the exponential height fog, the sky atmosphere and volumetric cloud. Foliage, we'll put all our procedural foliage volumes in, and I'll call that done. We'll leave the post-process volume outside on its own, as it's something that we sort of regularly come back to. So we've now got a much nicer organization here. As I said, boring, but you'll thank me in the long run when you're trying to find your assets in a hurry. So in the next episode, I will return with the promised mist materials, our planar mist and our volumetric mist. And stay subscribed for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.